Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Please bear with us a few moments as we allow everybody to enter from the waiting room and join us here at our conference series. The conference series has captioning ability for you. If you turn it on your own side, you'll be able to see the captioning, and we are recording this session. We will make it available in a few days for those who can't join us. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. If I could introduce now Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Paul?
Well, welcome to the first session of our conference on school choice in the post-pandemic era. This conference is a virtual webinar series that's will be held at the same time, that is from 12 to 1 each Friday for the next few weeks up through December 10th, though I think we'll take a break for Thanksgiving. The conference is sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance, known as PEPG here at the Harvard Kennedy School. So we are thrilled today to have Governor Jeb Bush with us as our keynote speaker, and we will introduce him momentarily. Let me first tell you the main themes of our conference. The conference as a whole is going to shed light, we hope, on the way in which school choice is evolving in response to the experiences parents and families and school leaders and policymakers have had during the COVID pandemic. Before the pandemic began, a couple of years ago, there was a feeling in the country that opposition to school choice was on the rise, and some of the coalition and backing for school choice was eroding, and the movement perhaps was breaking down. But in light of the pandemic, there is a contrary feeling emerging in the country today. We are finding the passage of new school choice legislation in states across the country, new tax credit programs, new education saving accounts programs, expanded charter school programs. There's a lot of interest in opening up to parents opportunities that haven't existed in the past. Well, I think part of the reason for this is the loss of learning that we have all witnessed during the pandemic. And we have noticed that this is the most serious among our most disadvantaged students. We've seen public school enrollments fall. We've seen chronic absenteeism rise. And as district schools have closed in-person instruction, families have turned to charter schools, which are showing a substantial increase in enrollments. Families are also turning to the private sector, which had been a declining sector prior to the pandemic, but it looks like it might be reversing today. The percentage of families homeschooling their children could have doubled during the pandemic. Now, no one knows how lasting are these changes. They might be just temporary responses, but they could be something more than that. And that's the topic that we really want to explore both today in our weekly sessions. If you miss a session, please look for it in a recording on the PEPG website, and you can catch up in that way. I wish to recognize Antonio Wendland, Nick Tavares, Michael Poor, who have all contributed to the conference in many ways, but I want to especially acknowledge the important role that Daniel Hamlin has played in putting this conference together. He's a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma and has worked with us here at PEPG before that. So he has done a great deal of choice on school choice and charter schools and homeschooling. And he's going to be sharing the responsibility for chairing the webinar along with myself. So Daniel, I turn the floor over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Paul, for the introduction. I have the honor today of introducing the first speaker in this series, 43rd Governor of the state of Florida and current Chairman of Excellence in Education, Jeb Bush. Governor Bush, as many of you know, served 2 terms as governor of Florida from 1999 through 2007. And he was at the time the first governor of Florida to be reelected to that state's highest office. During his time as governor, Florida's students showed considerable gains in academic outcomes in aggregate. So with the student achievement in the state moved from below 1 grade level at the start of Governor Bush's term to students achieving well above average scores near the end of his term in office. And these gains during that time placed Florida among the top 3 states for test score growth. The main hallmarks of Governor Bush's education strategy were school choice and accountability. And during his time as governor, Florida began assigning letter grades to schools based on student performance on state exams. And Governor Bush also oversaw one of the nation's most ambitious expansions of school choice. So Florida enacted the nation's first statewide school voucher program during his time in office. Also, a tax credit scholarship program was created, and that program now serves over 100,000 students in over 1,900 schools in Florida today. The number of new charter schools that went into operation in the state also grew rapidly during Governor Bush's 2 terms. Governor Bush is, again, also the founder. He's the president and chairman of the Foundation for Excellence in Education. He's also been co-chairman of the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy and chair of the National Constitution Center. And along with his really extensive work in the school choice arena, Governor Bush is involved and has been involved in many facets of education reform and has a great deal of expertise in really many different areas of education and education systems. So we're delighted to have Governor Bush here. So thank you again, Governor Bush, for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. Before we start though, Daniel, I gotta show you something. This weekend, you guys are going down. University of Texas is going to take you in football. That's just an aside. I don't want to start with hostile act. Education is important for all of us. I've had a passion for it. Starting when I was a candidate in 1998, I decided I was going to go visit 100 schools, and I got through that so quickly I decided to do 200. I ended up with 260 schools where I visited. And you see, when you get into schools back then, you could see that the whole system was designed for mediocrity, and it was heartbreaking in so many ways. You had really dedicated teachers that were stuck in a system that was very bureaucratic. You had kids that were being left behind. I'll never forget, Daniel, I was in the back of a high school in Central Florida, and the kid was studying on one of those little computers, the green computer screens. I was governor that long ago, and he was doing remedial work to pass an 8th grade level high school equivalency test to be able to graduate. He was going to pass, because we have grade inflation, he was going to be able to get his diploma if he could pass an 8th grade test. He was on his 3rd try, and this was the last time he could do it. And he could not answer the following question. A baseball game starts at 3, it ends in 4:30. How long is the game? And, this is a 17-year-old who'd been in the system his entire life that couldn't answer that question. And it just motivated me to say, look, we have to have high expectations for every kid. We need to empower parents. We need to have real robust accountability, because I happen to think that God's given every child the ability to learn. It's up to us to organize ourselves better. So that was the beginning of my journey. And now we work trying to help other committed leaders in about 40 states for them to continue the journey, some of which are doing phenomenal work. So in the post-pandemic world, the realization now, I think, is that a lot of parents now realize what the kind of education their kids weren't getting, because they became the first teachers and the only teachers for their kids in many places. And they saw that charter schools had a bias towards action and opening. And, their school was shut down in many parts all around the country. Private schools figured out a way to operate, even though they had really strained resources to begin with, because tuition, was hard for families to be able to provide. And so that awareness, combined with the digital divide that became so clear, I think has spurred an incredible renaissance in public and private school choice, and an explosion, interestingly, of homeschoolers. And the estimation, we'll have these numbers pretty soon, but in 1 year's time or two, a year and a half time, a doubling of the number of families that are now realize that this is an important part of their lives. The realization, I'm sitting here in my office, basically remote. I can work as productively here as I can going to an office and traveling and all that. That realization also, if I was younger, I could say, well, I could take care of my child's education with my wife, or I could create a pod where we could, have access to a higher quality education. And so we're seeing an explosion of choice, and I think it's really exciting. The learning losses that took place in the last 18 months is tragic, but I think we can, if we move to a more open system with more choices for parents, I think we can see a renaissance in learning.
Well, Governor Bush, I feel like your initial comment deserves some kind of rejoinder on football, but we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'll just leave it at that. So we recently, you mentioned homeschooling. We recently held a conference on homeschooling through PepG, and it was amazing how many parents turned out for that conference. I mean, we literally, I think we had over a couple thousand registrations. Most were homeschooling parents who came to watch research sessions, and I think we were just kind of amazed by it. But one of the hot button issues of the whole conference was homeschooling and regulation, and it seems that that issue is going to be magnified as more parents start to homeschool. And I was wondering if you could weigh in on that. How should homeschooling be regulated in some way? How should it be regulated, if so?
I don't think it should be overly regulated, that's for sure. At some point, you have to realize that parents are ultimately responsible for the life of their kids. And education, we've had a system that basically pushed parents away from their children's education for a long, long time. And now that's changed a bit, and that's great. And so I don't think we should overreact and create a bunch of rules on families that love their children with their heart and soul and want them to have the best quality education. I think there's things that policymakers can do to make homeschooling more integrated into society. For example, in Florida, Tim Tebow was homeschooled, but he played quarterback for Nice High School in St. Augustine his 3 or 4 years, and that was the path that allowed him to win the Heisman Trophy twice as a University of Florida quarterback. Had that not happened, I think his parents were going to homeschool, irrespective of whether they had access to extracurricular activities. So I think there are things that we can do to make the homeschooling experience even better. And we shouldn't be shutting it off. We should say that this is, and there should be some financial support as well for some of the things that may be difficult for lower income families to take care of. There's been an explosion of homeschooling across income groups, which is really encouraging. I don't think this is a bad thing. I always, when I was governor, I spent a lot of time with homeschool parents because they were the ones that actually came to the Capitol, because they weren't in the 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, 5 days a week kind of setting. They would take field trips and they would learn. And these were smart, really well-adjusted kids. So it's something that's quite encouraging in my mind.
Well, one of the most powerful arguments that's being made out there against school choice, against charter schools, against tax credit programs, is that it's taking money away from the schools. This was an issue that was raised in Massachusetts, and the public actually voted down an expansion of the charter school program, largely because so many parents felt like the public schools weren't getting enough resources the way it was. And why should we have a new piece of legislation that is going to take still more money away from our public schools? How do you respond to that concern?
Well, we spend more per student than any country in the world, other than the Benelux countries, which is around, that's like Dade County's student population, probably in Belgium and Luxembourg. So I think it's a false narrative. The simple fact is that charter schools, private schools, typically the expenditure, if it's supported by the government, is less. So you can make a counter argument, like the tax credit program in Florida or other places, the per student cost is less. And in a growing school district, you're building capacity without having to spend an arm and a leg through capital outlay dollars. And frankly, it's not their money. It isn't their money. It's the taxpayers' money. And the parents should have a right, just as they do for all sorts of government services, to make the choice about what's the best for their kids. A charter school, particularly, these are public schools. If I was a superintendent of a large school district that had traditional schools and magnet schools and charter schools, I'd embrace them all. These are all public schools, and I would celebrate the success of the charter schools and help them be even more successful. But this is all about the economic interests of the adults in the system. Look, I mean, Florida and many other states are spending, we spend less than the national average. Obviously, there's 25 states that probably spend more, and 25% spend less. But in Florida, we don't have these out-year pension costs like the big urban school districts in the north. I mean, they have to pay for the sins of the past. They've had to pay for collective bargaining arrangements that were made a generation ago. And so while they spend double per student what we spend in Florida, I'm not sure all of it goes to the classroom. And why should that burden be put on working families? I think the better model is the model that you see in Arizona, you see in Florida, you see in Indiana, to a certain extent you see in Louisiana, where in the case of Florida, more than half of the students, parents choose where their kids go to school. And if you look at the education outcomes, even though we spend less per student than some of the states that spend more, our outcomes are pretty darn good, particularly for low-income kids. So, I mean, this argument's been going on since forever, because that's the only argument they have. It's an argument of protecting the status quo at the expense, in my mind, of thousands and thousands of kids not reaching their ultimate capacity to achieve earned success in their lives.
So you mentioned the growth of charter schools during the pandemic. I think there were some estimates that say charter schools increased their enrollments during the pandemic by maybe 250,000 students. So a lot of students entered the charter school sector. Do you expect, will that be sustained? Do you think that kind of growth is going to be sustained, or are you expecting some type of return to normal after the pandemic subsides?
I think the growth of private school choice as well as charter school choice is going to continue to grow. And it's partially because of the awareness that you can make these choices as parents. Before, there wasn't that much awareness, and how important it is. The second thing I'd say is that legislatures all across this country have made dramatic changes in opening up their school systems. I mean, we've had, in the last year and a half, apart from new laws around homeschooling to make it more accessible, there's been growth in charter schools because states are opening up they're allowing for more flexibility for charter schools to be set up. And in the private school choice programs, there's been a dozen states that have embraced private school choice options, including 4 states that for the first time have created ESAs, one of which, West Virginia, is basically a universal ESA program. If you look at the number of kids that go to private schools in West Virginia, I think it might be the lowest of the 50 states. Now they're building a plan that would allow every parent to choose a school, whether it was public or private. I don't think that stuff's going to go away. As long as governors and legislatures are willing to take on these pretty powerful special interests in state capitals, if they're willing to make that the high priority, and we have great governors doing that across the board. Governor Justice signed the bill that, for a decade, West Virginia had no. I mean, we would advocate on behalf of families there along with other groups, and they never passed anything. And then they went all in. Missouri passed an ESA, Kentucky with a Democratic governor. I think they overrode the veto there. So the legislatures are on fire right now for these kinds of things. And I think it's going to benefit all types, students of every economic and, diverse background. So it's all good. And I don't see it going away. I really don't. Now, there's some things that make it harder for charter schools to get set up. You have capital outlay being the principal one. And I think that's a place where policymakers really need to focus. If a charter school is a public school, which it is, has to take all comers, they should have the same access to capital outlay dollars as a traditional public school. Or in places where there's a declining student population, and that exists in some of the urban core areas and other places, they should have access to those empty buildings to be able to establish charter schools. And if charter schools are successful in achieving their objective of rising student achievement, particularly for lower income students, they should be able to replicate that without having to go through the mind-numbing, politically motivated charter approval process. There should be a second authorizer so that if they're treated unfairly at one level, they could go to the state or some other jurisdiction to get charters approved. All of that is percolating across the states. Now, DC, nothing goes on there as it relates to this. In fact, I think in the Biden administration, you'll probably see efforts to try to choke this off and restrict the use of federal dollars for any of the kind of reforms that we're talking about here. But if you go to Oklahoma, you go to Missouri, you go to Montana for the first time, Arizona continues to expand dramatically. Florida every year passes other legislation that allows for more choice. 1.2 million Florida low-income kids now can access the ESA we've put in, directly paid for by the funding formula. We're in a renaissance that's just starting. I don't see it turning back.
Well, one of the newest things out there is the education savings account, and that seems to be an idea that's been perking since the pandemic began. This idea that you can use your money for just about anything. You can use it for hiring tutors, or you can use it for your pod that you're creating with other families in your neighborhood, or you can use it to pay for a private school or for computers. So there's just a lot of different things that this money can be used for. But isn't this putting too much of an onus on the family to sort everything out? Is this really an education reform that's going to be, to drive student achievement forward?
I think the way we should look at this is that we should organize the school system and the, whatever it is, Paul, the 700 billion that's spent K-12. We should organize it around the student. And every student is different backgrounds. There's some people, some young students that are newly arrived that may have language challenges. There are others that have developmental delays. Their parents know what the challenges are far better than the superintendent of schools of the 13,000 plus school districts. I don't think it's a problem to try to customize the learning experience and unbundle it, for that matter. Now, should we have, we want parents to be informed consumers, right? If you're just putting them out there trying to make these decisions by themselves, it's harder. And there are not great examples across the country of states that have created totally transparent means by which you can determine what the right school is, or determine who the high quality tutor is, or determine all sorts of things. We just don't have, governments don't work that well in the idea of creating transparency and providing solid information. I think that's a huge policy effort that needs to be done across the country. I don't know of a single place that really does that well. So if you have parents that love their children, and I would say, some of those that are trying to protect the bureaucracy, if I hear it once, I've heard it, dozens of times. particularly when I was governor, when people were scowling at me for these reforms that we made and they were all angry. They would say, well, you don't understand. Some parents just don't care for their kids. Okay, there may be some parents that don't care for their kids, but 99% do. And I think the duty of a school district and state policymakers is to make sure that they are informed consumers about what the options are. And then trust them to make these decisions and empower them to be engaged in their kids' education. Paul, when I was governor, we created a mentoring program, and we had a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal of 200,000 mentors spending an hour a week in the classroom. And I thought it was a cool idea. Colin Powell came down. We laid out the aspirational goal. We gave every state worker an hour a week off to be able to mentor. I mentored every Wednesday morning at 7:30 at Raw Middle School. Businesses embraced this idea. School districts were the last to kind of embrace it, but some of them did, some of them didn't. And the hardest part was getting committed adults to be allowed in the classroom to mentor. In 1999, this is ridiculous. We should open up the doors. I mean, there's safety considerations for sure, but do we always push people away that have a heart for making sure children learn? Is that the path forward in an incredibly challenged country right now, where we have these huge learning losses and gaps in learning that almost guarantee a child's not going to live a purposeful life? I mean, I think we need to rearrange or reimagine how we go about education and stop arguing about things that may have been relevant in 1950.
All right. Well, you mentioned a little bit, but just kind of switching gears here a little bit. You talked about the expansion of voucher programs across the country. And I have a question about the voucher program in Louisiana, because that's sort of been creating sort of a buzz in scholarly circles for a while, because the recent scholarly evaluations of that program kind of show underwhelming results for that program. And so there's a lot of debate about why that might be, where some have said the reason why the voucher students haven't performed so well there is that the high quality schools in Louisiana just didn't participate in the program, and it was more of the cash-strapped schools that ended up participating in that program. I was wondering if you could kind of weigh in on the case of Louisiana and what it kind of says about the design of voucher programs and possibly getting some of the better schools to participate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tension here that's pretty important to recognize, which is, on the one hand, you don't want to burden private schools with public problems, with public rules. For example, I think Louisiana requires their state tests to be administered for voucher students in the private setting. And it could be that the private schools aren't teaching to the curriculum the standards that are applied for public, for public schools. I don't have the details of that, but my guess is that that's part of the reason why they may have failed. And so if you create too many burdensome rules on what are private enterprises, private schools, you can create, a bad result. And so the tension, on the other hand, is that these are directly or indirectly, depending if it's an ESA or a tax credit program, these are directly or indirectly public monies. And so there is, I think, a duty for policymakers to make sure that the money is spent wisely, because you want taxpayers' dollars to be as effective, efficiently spent without fraud and abuse. So that tension exists across the country. I think that maybe Louisiana, even though they have a really robust voucher program in terms of people that are qualified to take advantage of it, they haven't built capacity of higher quality schools. Now, there'll be some schools, some of the elite private schools, that just don't want to participate. They're taking care of affluent families and they're good with that, and that's the end of it. But in states where there's more an open system, there are schools that are taking advantage of the tax credit programs or the ESAs to deal with the underserved. And I think that should be encouraged, to be honest with you. Look, I mean, we're living in a world where education outcomes matter a lot in terms of the livelihood of a child turning into an adult. access to higher education, all of this stuff. If you have higher expectations for a child, at the earliest age, they're going to deliver. The idea that somehow poor kids can't succeed in life is a joke. It's not true. But the system around them may not be the one that they need. And so figuring out ways to encourage all private schools in the states where there are private vouchers for parents to choose those schools, and for schools to set up programs to make sure that children aren't, they're not set up to fail, I think would be an interesting additional kind of policy move to deal with this issue that you bring up.
Thank you.
Well, Governor, you started Florida Virtual School. You sort of jump-started the whole concept of learning online, and it spread throughout the country, especially during the pandemic. I mean, just about every student in the country had an online educational experience in the first 2 months of the pandemic, and some of them have had nothing but an online education ever since the pandemic began. I mean, online education has had a real test. When you began it, I went down to Florida Virtual School. I was pretty impressed with it. I wrote it up. I was a big supporter of online education. But after seeing it go, across the country, I've gotten a bit nervous about it, because some of this loss of learning that we've experienced is probably due to the fact that a lot of kids needed to be in the classroom with a teacher, having a real live experience. And there's been emotional distress, and there's been problems with social relationships among kids, and even physical fitness has declined. So, okay, how do we square this circle? What's the right policy here for?
Yeah, and Paul, I would add that the quality of online learning ranges from horrible to really good. And so if you're offering online education, virtual learning, I think it needs to be unbundled, and B, it ought to be high quality. And there should be, from a policy perspective, a real focus on that. So unbundled, what does that mean? Well, it means that maybe you could accelerate the learning. If what is it? If I think it's 25% of all 11th graders are capable of taking college level work right now, and only 4% do, virtual learning could be a catalyst for dealing with that gap. Why should someone capable of starting as a sophomore in higher education not be able to do it? Well, because the schools don't have, they're not organized that way. You have 24 credits, you can't expand it. Virtual learning unbundled could provide AP classes, IB classes. It could be world-class because you could have scale with, really, really incredible teachers bringing it into the classroom or bringing it home, and helping the parent or the teacher in the classroom to be able to be, to be there to make sure it happens at an even faster rate. So I think virtual learning it can play a really important role of enhancing learning. It could deal with remediation as well. It could be customized and unbundled, but it's not going to be the end all and be all for the 74 million plus or minus students in our K-12 system. Kids need to interact. They probably need to we need to figure out as quick as we can to interact without masks. I mean, they need to be, if you want to restore normalcy, going to school, it's important for working families, working moms. It's important to get back to that. But maybe in the post-pandemic environment, you think about it differently, where there are more choices inside of the traditional K-12 experience that allows for virtual learning. And a lot of other elements of this. So I'm proud of the Florida Virtual School. It too had some problems, and I think there's been some remediation in that regard. But and it's grown again. Thank goodness. It's an important part of the learning experience in our state. In fact, Florida Virtual School provides learning to other states as well. During the pandemic, Alaska used it, which that's the ultimate version of a virtual learning experience. You're getting taught by Florida teachers in remote areas of Alaska. There's not, at least from the weather perspective, there wasn't much in common.
Well, we've got a pretty large audience here and questions are flying. I'm wondering if we should turn to the audience and field some questions. Would that be all right, Governor Bush?
Of course.
All right. Well, there's an interesting question here in the chat. And this comes from John Mullaney, who says, why is the charter school movement devolved into a Democrat versus Republican issue? In Maine, the Democratic legislature has become hostile to any alternate to the big district model. Any suggestions on how to change their minds?
Yeah, there used to be a left-right coalition for parental choice, and it was pretty powerful. When you had Arnie Duncan and his predecessor, and perhaps even his successor, believe in charter, the expansion of charter schools. That's great. So the problem now is that Democratic politicians are pressured not to be for that. I mean, almost across the country. Florida is a good example of more so in the private school choice area, by the way, not as much in the charter school area. There's Democratic legislators that do support parental choice because we've reached scale and now there's a constituency. So part of the answer is you need to build a constituency to sustain any policy in politics and political life. And this is a place where we're, we need to continue to work. But I've seen an erosion of the left-right coalition for parental choice, and it's disappointing. There are other issues now that come into play, social justice issues that create a wedge as well. And there's going to be tensions, I think, in the next couple of years as it relates to state legislatures and school boards dealing with this issue. There's a lot of misinformation about it. I would love to see the return of a belief that every child could learn and that we need to empower parents to make these choices, and high quality charter schools is one of the elements of making that happen. But you're right, it's changed. And it's kind of sad, to be honest with you. But most of, if you look at the legislative successes for choice in the last two sessions, it's almost all Republican legislators and almost all Republican governors.
And just to kind of dig into that a little bit more, one of our questions that we're looking at in this conference series is a possible division within the school choice movement itself. So, for example, you might have a beleaguered Catholic school system operating in a city, and then charter schools begin to operate, and maybe that takes away from Catholic enrollments. Or conversely, maybe you have a voucher program come into play, and then that hurts charter enrollment. So are some of these different parts of the school choice movement at odds with each other, or not? How do you kind of see that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, we're thinking about this and working with other organizations that are involved in parental choice efforts around the country. There shouldn't be a conflict. It shouldn't be a zero-sum game. And there are things that both advocates for private school choice and advocates of public school choice can agree on. There are common problems that it may not be the first priority of a voucher program, but if it has an impact, if something has an impact on both systems, if you will, then they ought to work together to solve that. So there's a series of smaller deals, if you will, smaller challenges that if they worked on together, it could rebuild the trust. Because if you allow this to be a zero-sum game, we're not going to get a good outcome. It's an important question, and I think there's some tangible things that, at least in our case in the foundation, and I know the American Federation for Children, led by my friend Bill Oberndorf, are focusing on this as well. How do we renew the coalition between charter schools and the private school choice movement? And it'll vary state by state, but I think there's real opportunities to kind of rebuild that coalition, because it's been tattered a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the issues that is going to come up before the Supreme Court this coming term that has just begun has to do with the Blaine Amendment, which was an attempt to change the US Constitution so that no money could go to a religious institution or religious school. And that was something that was proposed back in the 19th century, but it never got part of the US Constitution, but it did get part of a lot of state constitutions, and including in the state of Maine, where Mr. Blaine came from. And now Maine is in the Supreme Court. And the question there is, can they forbid schools that have a religious affiliation from participating in a school choice program when other private schools can participate? So Maine has a policy that if you don't have a school in your own district, you can go to a high school in another district. And that school, if it's not religious, then it can actually be compensated by the state. But if it's a religious school, they can't participate. So how's the Supreme Court going to decide this case, Governor?
I'm not a lawyer and I'm not on the Supreme Court, but I think if you look at the Espinosa ruling that happened, several years ago, and I think there's a pretty good outlook that the Blaine Amendment will be blown out of the water. And there is some irony to the fact that it would be a Maine ruling where Senator Blaine, served as the senior senator from Maine when this passed. It would be ironic, and it would be great. And I hope it happens during this session of the court. This is a vestige. We talk about our past. There's a lot of people wringing their hands about how bad America is all the time. This would be something that we shouldn't be too proud of, in my mind, that this was designed to discriminate against Catholics, many of whom were immigrants, and there was some concern of that we would have the Romanization of education. I mean, this country is diverse, and it's part of our power. If we have a set of shared values, which I think is eroding as well, but if we had that, diversity turns out to be a catalyst for all sorts of wonderful things. And to restrict religious institutions to be able to provide quality education for students when they have no other access, because as you said, they may be in a remote area, I think is wrong. And it was wrong when it was created. It's certainly wrong now. We've gone way beyond that. And I hope the court, I don't know what they're going to do, but I hope the court rules that it is that the state of Maine cannot do that.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing because there was, we tend to think of that ethnic conflict as something that was invented in the 1980s, but it goes really back to the very beginning. We've always had conflict among ethnic groups and among religious groups. And
well, I mean, that's how the KKK got founded, yeah. And how the Know Nothing Party, went its ascendancy and collapsed mightily, thank goodness. These populist kind of surges do happen in our history, and it's good to reflect on our history, to not just be blatantly saying everything is great. I think our history is replete of greatness and extraordinariness, if you will. But when we have problems, we should recognize them. And I think this was one of them. And it's totally obsolete in the world we live in today.
But one of the things that comes up in the discussion of school choice is, well, we will get Muslim schools. It's sort of not too much unlike the comments about we'll get Catholic schools. So we could get Muslim schools, and won't this tear this country apart?
We have Muslim schools in Florida. We have them across the country. Again, 95%, 99% of a Muslim school they're teaching the values that we share. Not every Muslim is a jihadist. I mean, this idea that somehow diversity is a problem. You can create these programs to allow for a modicum of regulation that protects parents from abuse, from radicalization, or whatever it is. and it's legitimate. I'm not a libertarian as it relates to these programs. I think there needs to be some degree of protection, but if you're closing opportunities because of a one bad apple, that's the way the regulations work in this country, not just in education. You have one bad outcome, 99 great outcomes. You regulate for the one, and it damages the 99. There's got to be a balance to this, and we seem to be kind of losing our ability to actually find that balance.
Well said. So Daniel, you have a question.
Well, I was just going to say, speaking of that, a lot of times you hear a lot of debate, particularly in cities with a lot of choice, about whether there should be some type of regulatory commission in the city to kind of manage the different types of schools. Do you think that kind of regulation is appropriate?
No. It makes me nervous. No, look, I think by and large, these choice programs, the only problem with them in many cases, they're too small. If parents are making informed decisions and they have many options, we're going to get higher quality education and we're going to get rising student achievement. And so I'm very nervous about, while I'm not a libertarian, I'm very nervous about, experts from up above creating rules on top of private schools. I don't think that that's the path forward. There should be elements of regulation with the light touch that deal with the issues of financial integrity, for sure, safety at the school level, public health issues. If you're taking government money directly or indirectly, these should be safe places, and there should be some understanding of what the teaching, the learning environment is. But to dictate how it's done, there's been an erosion of expertise being right. Really smart people turn out to be pretty dumb. And I worry about this regulatory entity being full of really smart people that aren't that smart.
So we have a question
That's
here.
just me, though. I'm kind of biased towards, I think in the midst of all this, we should have a bias towards action, a bias towards embracing, innovation, and a bias to be bottom up rather than top down. And I think we'll get a far better outcome for the millions of kids that really need a high quality education.
So one of the questions that has shown up here in the chat is, well, it's all good for the families who have the resources to make a choice, but there's a lot of families that don't have the resources to really sort out what is the best thing for my child. And this will just create more inequity, not address the inequities that exist in our society. How do you respond to that concern? Yeah,
I disagree. I think that the most voucher programs, other than West Virginia's ESA program that is universal, most of them focus on lower income families. The key is to make sure that parents, irrespective of their life circumstances, are informed consumers of the choices they have available. And I think that's a really important part of the next iteration of reform to deal with the issue that was brought up. But look, if you start saying, you stereotype people to say, well, you're low income, or you're a parent of color, or you're a single mom, and there's all sorts of ways that you can slice and dice our populations, right? And then you preclude or you exclude them from having the choices because they're not smart enough, and they're stuck in failing schools by the smart people restricting them going to a better school. I don't see that being morally appropriate. Let me give you an example of a friend of mine named Denisha Merriweather, who's now working at the American Federation for Children. She went to a public school in northern Jacksonville, Duval County. She was in second grade or third grade, I believe. She was held back 2 years in a row. Her family had some serious issues. She would have fit that profile of what the questioner's concern is. And I hear it a lot. Her grandmother, or her godmother, in effect, heard about the corporate tax scholarship program in Florida and got her into a Christian school in the same neighborhood. And within 3 years, she'd already caught up. She graduated. She was the first in her family to graduate from high school. She was the first in her family to graduate from a 4-year degree, and she got a master's in social work at the University of South Florida. She now is a very productive member working for American Federation of Children to support low-income families to have the choices that people that are privileged do have. And I think that is the better story. That's the real story. It's not to exclude people from being able to access that. It's to make sure that they have the proper information. And I go back to this basic belief that not every parent they may have drug addictions, they may have serious issues that make it hard for them to love their children with their heart and soul. But the great majority of parents, I would trust them to make choices for their children far more than me doing it, or you doing it, Paul, or a superintendent of schools doing it, or a governor, or a legislature. You got to trust parents to make these choices. And if we don't, we're actually creating, the actual problem that exists, which is some children are being able to, have the privilege to get a high quality education and some don't. We need to reverse that kind of mindset that impedes particularly low-income children from being successful in school.
Governor Bush, what would you say are some of the more promising ways that might be out there to ensure that parents have access to good information? So if you look at a lot of the scholarly literature on this, usually a common theme is that the way parents get this information is through their social network. They go to church and someone kind of informs them about a program in a school, and they kind of make their way in that sort of way through their social network. So how can it sounds like what you're proposing is a more formal way to try to inform parents at a larger scale. Is there anything out there that you've seen as promising in this respect?
As I said, I've not seen, there may be, school districts that do this very well. I've not seen it, but look, almost everybody in the country has a phone, and it's easy to communicate. If school districts were required to communicate what the choices were in the summertime before they're assigned a school, they would have, if they had the ability to access this information in an easy to understand way. I mean, like I remember we would provide the school grades for, that's part of this, is the school that my kid goes to, is it a good school? Is it F or is it A? People understand that. Doesn't require a PhD in mathematics to understand that. But we would send out PDFs of Excel spreadsheets. It's like mind-numbing. It had no relevance for anybody, much less parents that may not have the resources to be informed consumers. So there are tools that would make this easier for parents across the board. And I think that would be an important step. A lot of parents don't know that they can send their kids to, if they have a learning disability in states where there's vouchers for students with learning disabilities. They don't know it. If they were given that choice and they didn't think their IEP was being met at the local school, they could send their kids to a private school in quite a few places. But that information is really lacking. And I'm not surprised that a school district that feels like we're taking, that parent's taking money away from my budget by going to a private school. If that's their attitude, then they're going to make it harder and harder for parents to have that choice. Or if it's going from a traditional public school to a private school, there are ways that we can make this work. But you got to assume that parents, irrespective of their income, are capable of making these choices. If you just assume that they're not, to me, that is, it's dangerous. It's immoral to think that, in my mind. Given the tools to be able to be successful in making informed choices, rather than saying you can't have a choice because you're not smart enough to know what to do with it.
So that brings up a question here that somebody has posed in the chat that says, well, are charter schools, virtual schools, private schools really giving special education students the services that they need? Aren't they being forced to be in district schools and other students have these choice opportunities, but that's to the disadvantage of those in need of special education.
Well, if you have a voucher program that says you can go to a private school and you've gone to the school and you've seen the services they provide, and you're getting the funding that would have gone to the traditional school, which is more than the average per student funding. If you have those options available, and Florida was the first state to create a statewide voucher program called the McKay Scholarship Program, and that's been put into our ESA. There are private schools that emerge with those special skills to be able to take care of students. So, at least the Florida experience is that those options do exist, and there's some 40,000 or 35,000 students that go there, which is one of the larger voucher programs in the country. And guess what? If you measure, if you look at the NAEP results for kids with learning disabilities, Florida students, even though we have an option to go to a private schools, Florida's students in the public schools do better than the national average with kids with learning disabilities. More choices creates better outcomes across the board. Maybe not in Louisiana, but across the board. Daniel, the work that you do and Paul's done for many years does prove that parental choice yields rising student achievement.
We've got a question, on the Virginia gubernatorial race. What should, if Glenn Youngkin is to win, this question says, what should he be prioritizing? There's also sort of a follow-up here that says there are only about 7 charters in the state now, even though the state's had a charter law for a long time. And then there's a very small tax credit scholarship program that's for low-income families. What should Youngkin be advocating for, in your view, given the context for choice in Virginia?
Well, I hope he's advocating whatever his strategy is or whatever his plans would be in the campaign. This is, I'm going to really show my old school nature here. I honestly believe that political candidates should say what they're going to do, because it's about the only way you can do what you said you're going to do, is to say it up front, have the courage of your convictions, and fight for it. So when I ran in '98, I laid out the plan that we actually implemented. It was enhanced by the legislature, but in effect, it was my campaign plan, the A+ plan, and it became the #1 issue in the campaign, and I won. And so whether or not I won because of that plan or not, I declared a mandate. And the Florida legislature was motivated because it was such a high-powered issue, and they felt like they wanted to help their governor. So there's a lot of variables here. If he has a Democratic-controlled assembly or House of Delegates, whatever they call it up there, that could impede this. But I do think saying what you want to happen and have a plan that's thoughtful on how you implement it is the first step. The second step is to look at this as not a check the box moment. I think the better governors that have been successful in education policy is they're always pushing the envelope every year with another idea, because success is never final, reform is never complete, and one iteration of reform can't happen until the first one does. The next one has to, you can do this incrementally, and you got to stick with it. So I think that's an element of this that would be important. I'm hopeful this has waned a bit across the country, but this insidious idea that you pass a 3rd grader onto 4th grade and they're functionally illiterate is a tragedy of epic proportions, and it's, I think, morally repugnant. And there should be an early childhood focus for every state that says every 3rd grader is going to be at least a basic reader by the time they go to 4th grade, which is when they begin to use their reading skills to learn. Up till then, they're learning how to read. And there's all sorts of strategies, and I think our foundation is one of the leading places to develop those strategies, from pre-K to 3rd grade, to train teachers on how to teach children to read and to bring resources in that may not be in the school budgets, but where there's real, real interest in making sure children can read. There's a lot that can be done across the board to make that a high priority. I would focus on that as well. Then, of course, Virginia, for whatever reason, has had, it is a very closed system, very, very few choices, both public and private. And I hope he will advocate for that if he wins. And I hope, by the way, I hope Terry McAuliffe does too. I don't know what his views are on this stuff, but I mean, I would love to see Democrats get in the game as well for reform.
So let me wind up here by asking you a general question. Are you optimistic going forward? We're coming out of a pandemic where it's really been a bad hiccup in the road, and we're seeing declining learning across the board. Are we going to turn this around? Do we have the commitment to education that the country has always had in the past? How optimistic are you as to how well our educational system is going to do in the 21st century?
I'm optimistic because I've met so many, high quality teachers and school leaders and parents now being mobilized like never before. I'm optimistic that we're the most innovative country in the world. We're going to figure out how to allow students to learn at their own pace in their own way. We're not going to hold them back if they could learn at a faster clip, and we're not going to push them along if they haven't mastered the basic material. We have the capability today with technology and will to be able to transform our education system in the 21st century. There's all sorts of encumbrances for sure, but my attitude is the reason why I'm still involved in this. I mean, I stopped being governor like a long time ago, 2007, they kicked me out the door. I'm still involved in this because I see this as the single biggest tool for earned success for the next generation. More so today than when I was governor. More imperative, more important. And at some point, we're going to converge around that idea that we can transform this. This is not about protecting the system. This is about assuring children gain a year's worth of knowledge, relevant knowledge in a year's time. They do it over 12 years, and then their options are just mind-numbing in the world we're moving towards. So optimistic about the capability of Americans to adjust and to adapt and to transform and to be innovators. Not as optimistic with the existing system. I think it needs to be transformed completely.
Well, thank you very much, Governor, for your sharing these thoughts and ideas with us today. We want to make sure that all of you know that we will be holding this event on a weekly basis at exactly the same time each week up and through the middle of December. So thank you very much for joining us on our discussion, our conference on the future of school choice in a post-pandemic era.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Daniel. Hook 'em horns.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.